Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Hope One. My name's Frank Turek. And as many of you know by now, our friend Dr. Mike Adams has died. He was the UNC Criminology Professor, University of North Carolina at Wilmington. He was a Summit Professor. He was a columnist. He was an author. He was a free speech and pro-life warrior. He was a very good friend of mine, as well as our guest tonight, Detective J. Warner Wallace. In fact, Jim, Mike, and myself traveled the country for about the past 5 years doing a seminar we called Fearless Faith. But most importantly, Mike was a born-again Christian. He didn't start out that way. He started out as an atheist early on in his career as a professor, and then he became a Christian. As you, I'm sure, have heard, authorities are ruling this as suicide. The question is that really what happened? And if that is really what happened, why? Now, a couple of weeks ago on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast, I did a 50-minute tribute to Mike. I don't have time to go through all that again, and some of you have heard it already. If you haven't heard it already, if you're interested, please go listen to that. I want to get more recollections from my friend J. Warner Wallace tonight than my own, because mine's already been out there in that podcast. But before I get to Jim, I just want to let you guys know what we're going to do tonight. The first thing we're going to try and do is pay tribute to Mike. He was a great man. And we want to show you the Mike that we really knew and loved, because there's usually a difference between what you see in the media and what a real person or what a real person is really like. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about Mike's death, his tragic death, and even discuss the issue of suicide. Then we're going to talk about, hopefully, what lessons we can learn from this and what Mike would want us to do from here on out. How can we move forward? What can we take from this tragedy? And then we want to get your remembrances, your tributes, and any questions you might have in the YouTube feed or in the Facebook feed. At that point, we'll bring the great Jorge Gill on, and he will share those with us. So at this point, let me bring in Jim Wallace. Most of you know who Jim is, the great cold case homicide detective, coldcasechristianity.com, written several books, including Cold Case and Forensic Faith and God's Crime Scene, and some great kids' books as well. Jim is in California right now, and Jim and I were both very close to Mike right up to his very last day. So Jim, thanks for joining me on this tonight.
Yeah, how difficult was this? So we talked about how soon we should do something like this, and even how soon we should address concerns in the public or say much of anything. And I was, you and I both, you did a great job, by the way, on your radio show. Lots of people listened to that. I didn't tell you this, Frank, but I was in an event in Iowa for Cedar Falls Bible Conference. And you had that was on maybe just a couple of days, your radio show had been on the air. And I can't tell you the number of people who came to me and said that they had listened to your show and had questions, like the kinds of questions we're going to answer tonight about what happened to Mike, but also just really appreciated the approach you took, because you took an approach that was, it was informed and really respectful of that's what we're trying to do, right? Is respect the family's wishes, respect the privacy of the family, and also honor the man we know, because I think a lot of stuff, if this was a suicide, then a lot of baggage sometimes is laid at the feet of people who would commit a suicide, especially within the church.
That's right.
So I wanted to protect Mike's memory also, and so did you. But now I think we're at a place where we can actually talk about this stuff. So,
absolutely. Well, let's start with some of our remembrances of Mike, because you actually had some, Mike and I had a lot of private time, but so did you. I remember we did a Fearless Faith down in Mississippi, probably, 3-4 years ago. Yeah. And you and Mike, I think, were traveling from New Orleans, from the airport there, to try and get to this location in middle of Mississippi. And what happened on the way? You can share some of that.
This is so typical of Mike, right? So what happens is you have a kind of public persona. And let's face it, we all craft that public. And Mike crafted his. And a lot of that was him being very respectful, really wanting to make the case for the First Amendment, for freedom of speech, and really stretching those boundaries. And he spent so much time fighting for his own position as a professor. So you kind of think that's all there is to this guy, right? Is that public persona. And of course, you and I both know, I mean, you were close to him. As a matter of fact, most of the conversations I had with Mike toward the last couple of days were because you had called me and said, hey, maybe he had come to house watch for you, or you had conversations only a couple hours away from you in Wilmington. So there was you had a certain relationship. And mine was based on our long travel trips and speaking engagements as a group. And on that trip, I'll tell you, you know the name of the old baseball player. Who was it that he won? Yeah, Dizzy D. That's right.
Dizzy D.
He had a story. So we're on this car for maybe, I don't know, 3 hours to get from New Orleans to where the event was. I don't know why we flew in. I guess it was the closest airport. So we fly in, and now we're driving up, and we stop, we eat. You know, we're going to talk about everything in life. And of course, he grew up in this area of the South, so he had stories. And one of the stories he told was this fact that he had an opportunity to either get a signed signature from Dizzy, and he passed on it, or it just didn't work out for him. I forget the exact details, but he was talking about it in the car. And somehow it came up that Dizzy Dean had been buried someplace in this part of the state, like on the route that we were taking to get to the speaking event. So I said, really? So we, this is what a great age we live in, right? We all have the glowing rectangle. So we Googled it, and we find out, oh yeah, he's at this, and I'm telling you, he is at a cemetery that is like so many cemeteries in the South and small town America. My dad lives in the South in small town America, and you'll find a cemetery like, really, it's over here in this field. If you didn't know it was there, you'd never find it. And this is where we had to go. So I said, Mike, let's this is your chance to get a picture with Dizzy Dean, right? We're going to go and do it. And so he's like, well, how are we going to find this place? Because I'm telling you, we must have pulled off and on at least 3 times trying to find this little cemetery. And we eventually did. I took a picture of him standing in front of the.
We got that picture. I don't know, there it is.
Yeah. So there he is on Highway 49 North in Mississippi. That's where the GPS on Instagram located it. But here he is. You can see it says Dean there on the marker. So, he got a chance to stand in front and with his hero there, that he missed the chance to get a signature, but he definitely had a picture with him.
Well, a lot of people don't know. He was a big baseball fan. He liked to go to as many baseball parks as he could.
As you mentioned in the radio show, he supported himself as a musician, through college. And so we would always talk about guitars, because I was also thought I could be a rock star someday, which, that you saw that turn out. And I played on worship teams. And so we would talk about certain kinds of guitars and he would collect guitars. He would spend time at Guitar Center or other guitar shops, right?
Yep.
By the way, if you've ever talked to somebody who works at Guitar Center, they will tell you that the most of their clientele are not bands. They're old guys like us who think we are artists, okay?
That's right.
Who are spending money at these shops. And that was Mike.
When he came to my house, the hurricane that was here a couple of years ago, I said, Mike, you need to come to our house. You're in Wilmington. You're going to get nailed. Well, Wilmington got 41 inches of rain that 2 days. We got about 11 inches here, but he came here. He took my guitar, he tuned it up, he bought me a tuner and put it on the end of it. It's still sitting there. It's still upstairs.
Yeah, that's the last time you played, right? Yeah.
In fact, Mike's brother David found an old cassette tape in Mike's garage and put it up on his YouTube channel. If you look for David Adams, he only has a few videos up there. And one of them is a video, well, it's just audio of Mike and I think it was Katie and Mike was the band, something like that, and they sounded great.
Oh, I gotta look
doing
that up
these
now because
60s, 70s tunes.
Yeah.
So Mike was into music. He was good at it.
Yeah.
Got his way through college, and when we traveled with him, he just had pun after pun. I don't know if you can remember any of the puns, but some of the puns.
There are 2 people we work with who have mastered this. He is one of them, for sure.
Yeah.
And he loves satire, like you always said in the that was his thing. And Paul Copan is the other pun master.
Oh, Paul Copan. Yeah, he and Paul could go at it, I'm sure.
Oh, it's ridiculous. And it would be fun just to sit and listen, because you have to be kind of quick-witted to be able to think of how to connect this thing that's either sounds like something else or has a kind of a double meaning. And so he was great. But I'll tell you, typically this is what that trip to Mississippi where we stopped and got Dizzy Dean's picture. I remember. And Mike had a great sense of humor, and he also had a very boyish kind of innocence that you find kind of surprising. Like you might think, really, I'm surprised that somebody who's such a public figure who has got a book, who is very emphatic when he speaks, right? This is one of the things that rubs people wrong about it. This was watching the April rally, I think it was at UNC Wilmington, about the shutdown for the state, and where he got up and he talked about how he was going to, he was hoping that they would open the state again and all the things he said. Very emphatically spoken, right? I mean, you look at that guy and you think that guy is, well, it turns out that, to be honest with you, Mike didn't really have the level of confidence you might think he had. He was very, he was not an arrogant person. He was, on a personal level, you realize that there were some things that he was had a certain amount of innocence about and concern. So we get to this event in Mississippi, and you're the first person on the stage. You always start those Fearless Faith conferences, but Mike is number 2 on the stage. He goes on the stage second.
Right.
We're back in the green room watching this, and this is a crowd that has got a very proper demeanor in church, and sometimes you have to give permission to a crowd to laugh.
Yeah,
and to receive.
I tried to do that several times, and
yeah,
they wouldn't laugh.
You start right, and we know that you're a humorist, right? Like a lot of things you say are going to be funny, and in some ways, I thought Mike, as I'm watching Mike watch you on the monitor, I'm realizing, Mike is real. He feels like you're like the opening act for a band, right? Like he's in this band, and you're the opening act, and apparently this audience is not getting into the opening, but they were not responding. We had to give them permission. Eventually they did. Okay. But the first couple of talks, it was rather quiet in the audience. And I remember Mike in the back with me going, "Are you watching this?" I'm like, what? He says, "You realize that no one has laughed yet at any of Frank's jokes. And he tells jokes. And they should be laughing, right?" And like he was getting nervous that he was on stage next, and you were letting him down as the opening act because you couldn't warm up the crowd for him. See, and I thought that was just so funny, right? That's the way he kind of saw this. And of course, by the time we got done, everyone. But it's kind of like when you work with high schoolers. If the people who are in kind of the lead dogs in the high school packs are not laughing, then no one's going to laugh, right? Until we finally break through that barrier, then everyone's good with it. And that's what was happening there. But
there was a time when we were at Jack Hibbs's church, the great Jack Hibbs out there in Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills, not far from you. And something happened with the timing. I can't remember what happened, Jim, but you went like 27 minutes over into his time.
I know.
And from that point on, you were always known as 27 minutes late.
I know. And I don't know. And honestly, it's not like I couldn't do this in the amount of time. I think the monitor was wrong or something. And I'm going,
that was the monitor, I'm sure.
Oh, stop. But I can tell you that Mike was one of those guys and that's one of the lessons and takeaways for us, right? Is that you sometimes get a sense that you only get a piece of people in their social media, in their speeches, in their public teachings. And so it's too easy to think that that's the whole person. And Mike was a very sensitive guy, clearly. He was very creative. He liked to craft words.
Yep.
This is why when he works for Babylon Bee, and sometimes they start with a title that then inspires the column. Right. And that kind of crafting of titles is in some ways like if you don't ever listen to country music, but sometimes it's the idea for a title, which is a turn of a phrase or maybe a new way to use an old familiar phrase, then becomes the basis. Well, we could write a song about that. And that's kind of what Mike would do is he would think about it from the satirical title, and from that he would develop a column.
And this is what, to a certain extent, got him into trouble with the cancel culture, was because his satire, his humor, is something that the cancel culture either A, doesn't get, or B, doesn't want to get, and they think everything is literal.
And there are very few comedians right now who have viable...
I know.
Where it used to be you would stretch the edge of insulting even particular groups in your audience, right? In the live audience that you would just pick on or that you would insult in certain ways. This used to be fair game. What I'm starting to see now is that kind of window of what's appropriate has been so narrowly. This is why, that Seinfeld won't even do colleges anymore like he mentioned before. That is very true. He was interviewed by, actually it was Colin Cowherd, I think, who had that interview with him, where he said that. And that is very true. You're losing the opportunity, because what satire does is it unexpectedly smacks you in the face of whatever your sacred cow is. Well, I'm starting to get to the point where I'm wondering if any sacred cow is smackable anymore, because everything is being made a sacred cow.
Yeah, it makes the point in a much more effective way when you use satire. And Mike did that so brilliantly. He used satire to wake people up. Even the famous tweet that the university went psycho on against him when he said, "Massa Cooper, let my people go." I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't understand what that means, you're historically ignorant. Because what Mike is doing is he was just pointing out that the Democrats were the party of slavery, and Governor Cooper here in North Carolina is a Democrat, and he's holding all of these people in lockdown just like the slave owners did. It was just a satirical way of saying, Governor Cooper, you've gone beyond your authority. And yet everyone's going, this is racist. Those people just don't understand they don't understand history, number one, or they don't want to understand history. They have no sense of humor. And Jim, when all that was going down, and I got on the phone with Mike, as you said, he was at my house several times. He stayed and watched my house when we had to go bury my dad. He watched our dog and hung out here. And a few days after that, when I called him back in Wilmington, and it was just a few days before his death, I said, he's not right. There's something, he's disjointed. There's something going on. He was almost incoherent. And that's when I called you a second time in about 2 weeks. I said, Jim, would you call him? And what happened when you called him?
Well, the first time Mike and I will constantly go back and forth on issues that aren't related to anything important. They're little things. I think I had talked to him about some of the stuff at Summit. We had conversations in the months leading up to this, but they were always about, not about Mike, nothing about Mike particularly. I would always ask him though, because I knew that I knew what was going on in his life, and just wanted to make sure that he knew that we care about his life. Well, of course we do. But then you called me about a week before he passed and said, hey, Mike needs cheering up, call him. And I wasn't aware at that time of all of this pushback over these tweets. Yeah. So I called him, and I thought I had a really encouraging conversation with him. I felt like when we started the conversation, he was pretty down on himself, pretty down on his state of affairs, and was clearly disturbed by it's interesting. You might think that someone who's bold and courageous on social media has got a really thick skin, but that really wasn't Mike. Mike could almost not resist the temptation to say what was on his mind about things that he knew he had a right to say. In other words, he knew something about these things, but he wasn't the kind of person who could necessarily then weather the storm of reaction on social media. Sometimes I know people who basically that's why they do it. They post these things on social media to get the reaction, right? To either build a platform, to become provocative, that was not Mike. Mike was not making these claims to build. As a matter of fact, I think it was a response he was getting on social media that was so detrimental to Mike. It's almost like he couldn't resist the temptation to speak the truth. But then when the pushback came, he found it to be really hard to manage. And my advice to him that first phone call, which was about maybe a week before he passed, was just, hey, Mike, you need to block that noise out. In other words, if there's people I know on one edge of the spectrum who I know I cannot influence, and they're just there to hammer me, they're just there no matter what I say, they're just going to be the hammering this nail, I have no problem blocking those people. I don't need to hear that negativity. If I've already gone to their website, I've seen that these folks are entrenched in their position. They don't care what my position is. They're just here to hurt me, right? Or hurt what I'm trying to say. I block those people. And if there's somebody who's even with me but is constantly saying things that are distracting to you, you can mute those. You have these options, and Twitter was one of those places where he was posting a lot. And you have also on Facebook, you have options. Stop hearing the negativity if the negativity is starting to twist your own self-perception, right?
Yeah, especially if it's like another Babylon Bee headline recently was something like, man wondering why he's so depressed when all he does is spend, 15 hours a day on social media. I mean, if that's all you're doing, and you're getting a lot of negative input, that's going to drag you down. And so your advice to Mike was good, and I thought he took that initially.
Yes.
But there was something else going on in the end, Jim, because he was not tracking logically with what we were telling him. He thought his life was over. He thought that he had no future, and it just didn't line up with the facts. I mean, you spoke to him, I spoke to him, Scott Klusendorf spoke to him, Jason Jimenez, there's many others that did, Jeff Myers. And for some reason, it was like he couldn't quite comprehend what we were saying or didn't realize that what we were saying was true.
Well, and I will tell you that after that first conversation, he said that, man, you just encouraged me more than anyone has encouraged me so far. Thanks, I'm good. So I hung up with him thinking, okay, he's going to be okay. And now the next time we talked to him was probably the day before he passed, probably the day before. And so I called him, and I could see that no approach I took previously was going to have the power of the previous approach. That no matter what I said, that Mike was determined to, he was already, he is convinced. Now, what was interesting about Mike, and this goes to show something about his character, the assumption is that Mike is this abusive, vile. This is what the other side will say about him. Mm-hmm. And the reality of it is that Mike was actually very innocent in some ways, and was kind of shocked by the pushback. So we talk about cancel culture. It turns out that really, yes, we can get canceled, but a lot of what happens in cancel culture is you allowing the other side to cancel you. Mm-hmm. You get to a place where you're like either tired of fighting, or maybe you start to believe what is being told to you. And so I was not ever quite sure with Mike where he was on that issue. But I always say it this way: if you don't want to be canceled, you have to have either financial autonomy. You also need relational autonomy. You have to be in a place where you have no donors, no sponsors, no boss, no source of income they could attack. And two, don't care what people say about you. And if you have those two things in place, you can go a long way and be the happy warrior that Mark Stein wrote about when he wrote about Mike Adams' passing.
Yeah, if he did write quite a bit.
In fact, there were some that, Frank. I think he started to lose those two, a sense in his own mind, because they forced him into a retirement. Mm-hmm. Okay, and although you and I look at that and say, well, you know, he certainly could have rebounded from that. In the moment, as men, it's really hard to lose the identity you've been carrying for 20 years. I am a professor over here, and that's who he was. He would always be introduced this way. The first thing you would say is, oh yeah, that was kind of his X, right? The X factor. He was the University of North Carolina professor at Wilmington.
You said something before that struck me as probably true for most men, even though it might, as Christians, we ought not think this way, but we're fallible. And you said something like, you can't just retire from something, you need to retire to something. Yeah. And for men, quite frequently, we get our identity. I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm saying I'm just being honest.
It is, yeah.
We get our identity from what we do. Yeah. And if we lose our identity, we lose our job, we lose our vocation, suddenly we don't think we're anyone anymore. And when people are piling on us on social media and elsewhere, the most vile stuff you could imagine. In fact, for those of you that listened to the podcast I did a couple of weeks ago about Mike, you'll learn that Mike had a death threat. That's another reason he came to my house to stay here. And the FBI checked into it. This was a credible death threat. This is from the people who say they're fighting for inclusion, tolerance, and diversity, giving a University of North Carolina at Wilmington professor a death threat. Now, I don't care who you are, death threats are not something you ever want to deal with. And so Mike had this avalanche of negativity just bury him. And it seemed like all of us, many of us even talked to him about the issue of suicide. Mike, you'll never do that. No, I never do. But none of us, listen to me, people, none of us know what we would do in a similar situation. Peter said, Lord, I'll never deny you. What did he wind up doing? He denied him 3 times. I'm not saying Mike denied the Lord, don't get me wrong, but Jeremiah wanted to die. Moses wanted to die. There are biblical characters that wanted to die. Sure. And we don't know what we would do in this similar situation. And we think, and we don't have autopsy results yet, complete autopsy results, but there may have been something organically wrong with Mike in the final days of his life. We're still waiting on results. And We don't know if we can share that or not.
Yeah.
But even if there wasn't, we don't know what we would do.
Well, here's the thing. So I've worked so many suicides over the years, right? Because if they're even slightly suspicious, they're going to land on my desk, and then I got to clear them. And it's not uncommon at all for people to be questioned about their suicidal possibilities or tendencies, and they will deny that because the last thing he wants is you to come over to his house and remove his guns, right? Because you could be suicidal. So people will say things, even if in their mind they've already got the plan rolling, they've already started to move the ball forward. But again, you have to get to a place, and I think that's what happened with Mike. The nature of Mike is not as tough and caustic and obstinate as the other side would portray. Instead, he was rather soft-hearted and childlike in some ways. And as the kind of response grew, especially that movement, how many signatures were on a petition?
Yeah, movie stars coming out against him.
Yeah, movie stars
didn't know anything about the situation, but had no sense of humor, no sense of history, couldn't understand satire. Right. And just went after him. But Jim,
I'm looking at the article that Stein wrote, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Stein wrote. I thought that was just a great, it says, he seemed like a happy warrior, but who knows? It's a miserable, unrelenting, stressful life as the friends fall away and the colleagues who were socially distant years before COVID turn openly hostile. I don't know if that actually happened with Mike, but he's talking in general. People who take the banner of a cause like this that is unpopular with culture, and right now conservative causes are unpopular with culture. They need the support of other conservatives, because if they don't have that support, it starts to feel like you're alone. Like maybe not only are you alone, and I think that Mike started to struggle with this. Am I alone because I'm not right? I mean, am I alone because my position is something about my position or the way I'm expressing it is because
you start to doubt. Yeah.
It's all negative. He says there are teachers who agree with Mike Adams at UNCW and other universities. Not a lot, but some. And there are others who don't agree but retain a certain queasiness about the tightening bounds of an acceptable opinion. And they all keep their heads down. So the burden borne by a man with his head up, such as Adams, is a lonely one. And it can drag you down. And the compensations, invitation to discuss your latest town hall column on the radio or cable news, are very fleeting.
Mike, Jim, I can't tell you how many times Mike told me that people would come up to him privately, people in academia at his school, and say, "Hey, Mike, I'm with you. I just can't say anything about it, though.
That's the kind of
I don't have tenure yet. But when I get tenure, Mike, then I'm going to come out." No, they didn't.
Yeah.
You know,
that's right.
How many people will whisper? In fact, Ben Shapiro was talking about this recently. Ben Shapiro will get texts from his friends who are on the left. "Happy birthday, Ben. Just don't tell anybody I said it."
Yeah, right.
I mean, they will run him down publicly, but privately say, "Ben, I'm with you," or "Ben, I like you." Same thing happened to Mike.
That's right. And so what happens here, and what happened with Mike, and people don't understand that loneliness, right? There's a sense in which, look, anytime we were doing a Fearless Faith, if a question came up related to freedom of speech on campuses, what you might expect on campuses in terms of the kinds of worldview that's going to be presented, well, Mike would field those. That was his area of expertise. If a question came up that was more apologetic in nature, well, then you and I would field those. He even was alone because he had the most robust understanding and had been through a tenure denial process that he had to litigate, which he won after 7 years. So he ended up knowing a lot about the system. And you might think that someone who's been through that, it turns out that every step of that part of his life was a bruise. And it was a bruise that maybe he hid from us, but it turns out every negative comment, he would sometimes take those negative comments and turn them into columns. As you know, that one you read, which is just one of his most famous ones, right? The most reprehensible.
An embarrassment to higher education.
Yeah, embarrassment to higher education. Great column. But I'm telling you, I know Mike well enough to know that when he got that first letter from a guy who called him an embarrassment, he responded in a very whimsical way. But that was also a bruise. And every negative comment on social media, those were also bruises. You might call them paper cuts. And after thousands of these that he allowed to seep into his soul, he was starting to struggle, I think, with exactly what Mark Stein is talking about in that article.
Yeah.
Now, look,
I submit to you, Jim, if you look at the student testimonies on Mike Adams' obituary page, these are student testimonies. If these things were said to him a month ago, Mike Adams would still be with us right now.
Well, here's the sad thing about this. I don't know if you knew this or not, but I used to always, both of us, you and I, and Mike would spend an entire season every year with Summit Worldview Conference. And so I would go there for every session, and I would see Mike at every session. We would have breakfast together with the students, right? And I'm telling you, I know from the person who brings us up, who books all these speakers for Summit, I know that the students rate the speakers. Okay, they rate them. Okay, my goal every year is to beat Mike Adams. Okay, and I never could. No, it turns out that the people he spent time with loved him.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why he was my goal. My goal was to beat Mike Adams. Okay. But I could never do it because, and all of those folks came out on his obituary page and wrote about, but here's the problem, right? The problem is that I think that people who would say something kind about Mike, the truth about who he really was, and you got to know in an interpersonal way, were sometimes probably even afraid to post that kind of stuff on social media because the enemies of Mike will become the enemies of you. And then all of a sudden, this is exactly what we're talking about. So that happy warrior, who for the most part has been a human shield for the rest of us who don't want to be the target, eventually that wore him out.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this, Jim, because you and I have come from different places on issues of politics. I don't mean we disagree politically, but I'm a little bit more politically out front than you are. Yes. Just because I've written 2 books on politics. I wrote Legislating Morality with Dr. Geisler back in 1998, and then Correct, Not Politically Correct back in 2008. And so I've kind of taken an out front stand on politics. That's why I was fired from Cisco and Bank of America.
That's exactly right. And Frank, that's because not only that seems appropriate to me because that is part of your personal narrative. What pushed you into apologetics full time was this experience you had that you can leverage to explain why it's not. And I always say this is that God, I think what we disagree is how out front ought we be in particular fronts, right? And
so let's deal with this question because you have a phrase that I think is right, but it has to be properly understood because if it's not properly understood, I think it gives people an excuse to be quiet when they should speak up. And the phrase you use is "stay in your lane." Can you explain that?
Yeah, so what I always talk about, and we talk about this with our CIA group, which we just had last week. If you missed it, you need to sign up for next year for sure, because if you want to be able to make the case effectively for what it is we believe as Christians, even if it's just pure evangelism, you will benefit from the work we do at CIA. So I would just suggest you get online and start saving save your calendar spot for next year. It's about the same time every year in August. Okay. That being said, I talk about to the group, I always say that to be the most effective influencer in culture, you need to figure out what is it that God has uniquely gifted you with from which you can draw your source material, your source information. What is your X? What is the thing that is so synonymous with your identity that I could actually just fill in the blank? And so, for example, I'm the one who, the guy who's from India who's got the Indian accent and speaks so eloquently. That's Ravi. I mean, if I didn't know that description alone, that's his X. Who's that guy who's super smart who debates all the atheists? That's William Lane Craig. I mean, everyone knows who that is. That is his X. And he leverages that X to influence culture. It doesn't mean, by the way, that William Lane Craig will never talk about politics. It doesn't mean that Ravi would never talk about politics. It just means that your X gives you the platform from which to influence culture. And so I always say, figure out what your X is. Look, I was not going to be able to run from the fact that I did 25 years in law enforcement and I've been a detective for 15. I was not going to be able to run from that. That's my X. That's who I am. So I try to leverage that. But the question is, leverage it to do what? And I don't think all of us are the same person. I think that all of us are biting the apple, the cultural apple, from different angles. And like Scripture says, some of us are the wrists, some of us are the fingers, some of us are the elbow, and we figure out how to work together as a community. So while you might come out and say, well, look, my background shows me how this issue of tolerance shifted and then became intolerant and why this has an outcome in it. Well, that's part of your personal narrative. And I'll say that mine is, how do I know that something as an eyewitness claim is actually true of the past? That's mine. Now, look, I will, there are times, if you look at my work on Town Hall, you'll see that I have written columns that have to do with what a current event, whatever the current event is. But most of the time, I stay in my lane as a collector of evidence that makes certain inferences about what the evidence might mean. Only I'm doing it now with the Christian worldview. Evidence for God, evidence for Jesus, evidence for the reliability of Scripture.
I get that. That's your emphasis. The issue, though, is sometimes people will think, well, look, I'm just going to try and get people saved, and then that will take care of any political issue that I'm concerned about. The problem, of course, with that thinking is if that's all you do, you're never going to convince everybody to become a Christian, and that means you're never going to speak on any political issue, and that's why people like Mike Adams, who are out on the front line, don't get any support, because the rest of us are going, oh, that's not my lane. I can't say anything about that. I just think that's just crap.
Here's what I would say.
Start standing up, because this country's going down the tube, and so is the church with it, and we're not going to be able to preach the gospel in this country anymore. Let's get moving.
But if you're going to speak on that issue, you stay in your lane when you speak it. Here's what I mean by staying in your lane. The lane does not take certain topics off the table. The lane just dictates how you address those topics. So my books always start with cop stories. And then I move into the evidence and draw the parallel. That's my lane. It doesn't preclude me from talking about any number of political issues, but when I do talk about it, I will probably be using a parallel from my work.
Okay, well, that's good. But what I'm saying is I don't want to give anybody the excuse to think that my Christianity's over here and everything else is over here, and so I don't need to speak to these issues. Because look, friends, if you don't think politics are important, it's not my first calling, obviously. Jim and I are agreeing that we have different X's, and we major in different things. But if you don't think politics are important, you don't think the gospel is important, because politics affects your ability to preach the gospel, because you can't see this broadcast that we're doing right now in Saudi Arabia. You can't see it in China. You can't see it in North Korea. You can't see it in Somalia. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. Politics affects our ability to actually live our Christian life. And I'm so tired of Christians hiding under their desks while people like Mike Adams are out front and they take all the hits and we go, oh, sorry, Mike, I couldn't say anything, and now you're gone.
Right. I just wish, Frank, you were passionate about it, though, because this is so lame. You're such an apathetic jerk. Anyway, the point, though. Yeah, you're right. How many times did Mike send us an article that he had written, and we didn't know he wrote it because we're not on Town Hall.
I'm not saying you're doing this. I'm simply saying
no, right.
Too many Christians.
Well, this is what I'm trying to say, is that all of us have, so this finger cannot exist without this wrist. So whatever this wrist does, this finger needs to support. So when Mike sends me something and says, hey, can you put this on your social media? Because he had a small social media platform compared to you and I. First thing we do is we bounce it out. Because we agree with Mike. But I can't write it like Mike. I'm not near as funny.
No.
Okay? So I want to take what Mike has written and leverage it with the audience that I have, because, again, I'm just the finger supporting the wrist. And that to me is – so if you think to yourself, well, look, does that mean I have to hop in? Well, you're probably not going to be able to hop in, because Mike had contacts with people now, Daily Wire, Town Hall, that allowed him a platform that most of you listening to this don't have. But what you can do is you can leverage the material of the person who's the wrist, who's doing the work, when you're only the finger. And that means we have to be vocal a bit to kind of – now, what I often say is I am not a political creature for a couple of reasons. I do have a more Billy Graham, Franklin Graham approach to this. You typically would think of it as being politically motivated, but in the end, we're really gospel-centered, right? And I'm not gospel-centered enough. Even as an apologist, I feel like I want to be more of an evangelist, right? Lee Strobel is a friend of ours, and Lee's the same way. And I think that Lee is he makes sure the gospel gets preached. And I'm like, wow. I need to do more of that, because in the end, the cure for all of this is the gospel, but I get it. I would also say, though, that some places where the government is not aligned for the easy preaching of the gospel is doing much better there than it's probably doing here. So I just think that the gospel has the power of God. And so in the end, I want to make that my major. But I get it. These are things look, you and I, we can argue about this. And I told when we talked earlier today, I said, let's save this as two brothers talking about this for this format on YouTube.
The church can flourish under persecution, but we don't wish persecution upon it. And I really don't think the church in North Korea is doing better than the church here in America, despite the fact that the church here in America, in many places, is an inch deep and a mile wide. There are sincere believers here. In fact, there are more Christians in California, believe it or not, than virtually any other state.
No, that can't be true.
Huh?
Is that true?
Yeah, that is. There's 40 million people living in California. So
when I'm in the South and I tell people I'm from California, I swear to you, they will say, "Really? Are there Christians?" Like they're not making a joke. They're asking seriously, "Are there Christians in California?" Yes, there are tons of us. Anyway,
there's 40 million people in California, so there's a lot of Christians there. They're just outnumbered by the secularists.
Let's go back for a second to Mike. Okay,
mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. And I don't think anyone supported Mike's work more than we did, and no one gave him a platform larger than you did by asking him to come be part of Fearless Faith. And he had a great platform, great opportunities to. I don't even think it matters. If you have the truth, and Mike had it, you need to speak it. Yeah. And Mike spoke it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we all bite that apple from different angles, right? And also, to be honest, Mike had a personal narrative. They gave him the opportunity to speak. Listen, you know his stories. Every time he got on the stage, he kind of drew out of that well, the well of his experience at the university campuses. And I don't have that experience. I can't take this. And if you're listening to this, you may not have that experience, but you've got some experience from which you can draw and you could support. And that's the biggest thing for Mike, I think, in the last days. In the last days, I know he did not feel alone because, man, we saturated him with phone calls and invitations. He was not alone in the sense that he didn't have friends.
No, his fiancée was in touch with him every other hour.
Okay.
Wonderful lady.
So I'll tell you why I say it all the time. Cancel culture comes from fiscal autonomy. If you don't think you have it, you start to worry. And there were times when I thought that Mike was he ready to be retired? I don't think he would have chosen to be retired at that time. And I think he realized at some point he did concern himself about, well, does this mean that I am no longer a viable professor? I don't know what he was thinking, but I know that there was some aspect of that was disturbing him. Also, it was clear that he really was very soft-hearted toward the criticism. In other words, that it was injuring him in some way. And that's the kind of person that most of us would say, wow, that's really just like everybody else. I mean, he was very human. Yeah. In the sense that, like us, he bleeds when you cut him. And like us, he has the same concerns about, can I take care of the people I love? Do I have a future? Also, I think he had concerns about, have I done it the right way?
Yeah. Have I overstepped my bounds? Have I pushed the envelope too much? Because he admitted he thought he had on occasion.
Right. And I'll tell you something. That alone, there was a future for Mike Adams in a movement that loves humility, that loves us to find new ways, to be changeable, to be adaptable. Mike Adams was all those things, although I think the press will portray him as the most rigid, unbending. No, that was not Mike Adams. And these things.
You mean the press isn't fair, Jim? This is a news flash. I never knew that. The press isn't fair.
Yeah.
Gee.
No kidding, right?
Any conservative that sticks his head up is going to take a lot of heat, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's do this, Frank. Let's talk a little bit about the accusation or the concerns people have written to both of us. Was this a murder?
Yeah, go ahead. You're the expert here, so you take it, Jim.
Well, people will say, why don't they conduct an investigation? Well, of course, they did conduct an investigation. I actually had a chance to speak with the investigator in Wilmington who was sorting through the details. And the investigation has a conclusion. And the conclusion, it was a suicide. And I looked at also the details. Also, we're getting the preliminary details from the autopsy. It was a suicide. And it's not as though, and when you do a suicide investigation, you're looking, number one, is the kind of injury consistent that it could be committed by a person on himself, right? Because if it's like, an injury that clearly requires a certain amount of distance or is awkward in some way, there's no way you could commit this kind of an injury to yourself, well, then we have bigger questions. So, and everything about the injury seemed like it was consistent with a self-inflicted injury. But not just that. We all had an experience with Mike in the last week that when it was all said and done, and we find out that he's passed away, like all the light bulbs started to go on, right? All of the conversations we had, it all started to make sense. So it's very different, for example, if I find something.
It made sense because we realized that the sense that we were talking to him didn't make sense to him.
Yeah, right. In other words, nothing about suicide makes sense. I get that.
Yeah.
But what I mean is you can see the contributing factors to a state of mind.
Right.
Now, if, for example, something different occurred, let's say, for example, he was really optimistic about this new role he was going to play in this organization, or a part on a movie, or something he's been talking about for weeks, and he's so excited about it, and he goes out and he gets a haircut that day, and he's got some new clothes because he's going to go for this job interview tomorrow, right? And then all of a sudden we have an injury that you can't even inflict on yourself. Well, now I got a different kind of case. I have nothing about state of mind preceding, and nothing about crime scene evidence that makes sense from a suicide perspective. But if you've got a runway that starts to look like something's about to take off, and then you have evidence at the scene that looks like is consistent with self-inflicted injuries, well, then I think that's how all suicide investigations are conducted. And I'm very satisfied that we know the truth about how Mike passed. And I think as a Christian community, this is one of the things that you and I waited so long to talk about. Number one, families need to have the right to be the first speakers of any of this truth. And we've already consulted with David, with his family. We already you've already gotten permission to talk about it, even before the last radio show. So there's an aspect of that I feel I'm comfortable that now is the time that we can answer questions and talk about it. But even from a 30,000-foot view, I think what I'd like to say in all of this is that this should be a cautionary tale for how we use social media and the power of social media. It's got some great, powerful positives, but you have to guard yourself against the negatives. And a lot of this is a cautionary tale for young people. And also it's a cautionary tale for those of us. You said something important earlier, really important. And that is that it's all too easy for people to hammer him on social media. If you even look at the reports of his death, you will see that the first comments sometimes are the most horrifically negative comments.
Racist and vile.
Yeah,
I mean, even his...
Yeah,
even university.
He was the author of controversial tweets, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so fine. But isn't it interesting? Then after you pass, when you're already gone, how many times do you see that people will not visit the dead person but until they're dead, and then they go to the funeral? And they had a chance to see that person in the last year and didn't make any effort at all, but they are there for the funeral to pay their respect. Sometimes comments can be that way. All the comments on the obituary site are so amazingly positive.
Even from liberal students.
Yeah, from
liberal feminist students who he was supposedly against politically. He was against them politically, loved him.
That's right. People who held very different views from him, but they were his students at UNCW, had glowing things to say. I honestly do believe that if there had been a balance in the response to Mike Adams while he was alive, he would have been able to process the balance and seen the value in what he was doing. But he probably would have still had some self-correction from the negative comments, but he would not have thought there was no sunshine left. All it was clouds. And I think that's why Stein's article, and I encourage everyone to read it. Just Google Mark Stein, Mike S. Adams, you'll find it. It's about the unhappy warrior. That is a cautionary tale for us also, that we have to be people, like you said, who are vocal about our support for people who are otherwise being ostracized by the culture.
There are 3 articles you want to read on this that I've seen. Mark Stein is one, The Unhappy Warrior. Also, Jeff Myers of Summit Ministries, the president there, wrote a nice piece about Mike. And so did David French, who politically doesn't agree with Mike on, say, Donald Trump. He's an anti-Donald Trump person, David French is, but he wrote a very nice, long piece about his friend Mike Adams, because David was Mike's attorney for those 7 years, one of his attorneys for that 7-year lawsuit he had against UNC Wilmington. That's right. Friends, one of the lessons that Jim and I both want to communicate to you is that, number one, if you're on the front lines, thank you. And get people around you who can support you routinely. Number two, if you're not on the front lines, but you know somebody who is, you need to support them. You need to continually encourage them, because they're going to get a whole bunch of satanic feedback on social media that they don't need to hear. And when they do hear it, it's going to tear them down. And so you really need to come up and be a buttress. You need to be a foundation. You need to be a well of support for those people.
Yeah.
A shield, yes.
Yeah.
And so please do that if you would. And we do want to spend some time here getting any remembrances that you have for Mike Adams, Dr. Mike Adams. So if you want to put them in the chat for YouTube, just put in big letters Mike, or let's say Adams, that'd be easier to find. Put in big capital letters Adams and put your little tribute there. If you want to say something about Mike, please do so. If you have a question for Jim and I, we cannot share personal information, quite obviously, but any question that you have theologically or anything about our friendship that you want to know, or anything that we can share, we'll be happy to share with you. So you can do that on YouTube. You can do it on our Facebook page. And the great Jorge Gill, once he gets a few of those, will come online here with us and share that. I want to say one other thing about Mike. His sense of humor was so good. I didn't mention this in the podcast, but Mike also tells a story when he does Fearless Faith about a school, I think it was UNC Greensboro, if I'm not mistaken, who had some sort of porn star come and give a lecture, but Mike was denied. They gave student funds to the porn star, but not to Mike. And so, of course, Mike, through the Alliance for Defending Freedom, immediately decided that he was going to challenge this. You know, I'm a conservative professor and I can't speak there, but this porn star can. And so he did, and he won. And they wound up actually paying him a little bit more than what they paid the porn star. So during his talk, Mike says, I got on the phone and I called my mom, and he said, I was crying. And Mom said, Mike, why are you crying? He said, Mom, I'm worth more than a porn star.
Yeah, right.
That was his kind of humor.
Yeah.
And of course the audience just loved that, because he was just funny, satirical,
yes,
and punny. He was so punny.
Yes.
And I remember you saying this, Jim, it's so true. When we would see a tweet by him, we could hear his voice in it and we would laugh. Other people who maybe are wound a little bit too tight or don't know history would just get spooled up about him.
No, listen, that's a great point. And that's a cautionary tale also. And there's a reason why when things are important, I need to communicate them to somebody. I don't email them back. You know, there's lots of times when I'll just call you back. And the reason why I'm calling you back is it's part of it. You might think, well, I'm just trying to save it in 2 minutes typing. Yeah, but there are certain conversations that you need to hear my voice so you can know that I'm in it with you, or how I really feel. And that is the danger. Now, it's one thing to have YouTube videos. That's more helpful, right? Because at least you can see it. But if you just have a phone call, you have my voice inflections. And so in the end, written statements, this is also to be careful when I do forensic statement analysis, because the blank written statement, I gave this interview 30 years ago, and I have the transcript of the interview. It's easy to make people look guilty in a transcript. Now, let's play the audio, though. If you play the audio, you're like, oh, actually, it doesn't really come off that way in the audio. Or the audio is a better level of what is the intention of the actual author. So I would just say this to all of us who do this work publicly, is that what was happening is every time Mike would tweet something that the other side would say was offensive, those of us who knew Mike Adams personally would hear Mike's voice in it. We would hear the way he would pause, start. We could eat Mike, you know, when you tell a good joke, sometimes Mike kind of start to laugh a little. In other words, he would kind of start to respond to his own humor before he even finished saying.
That's right.
And you can hear the jovial nature with how he intended it to be. And so he would say those things. Well, I started to read everything that Mike did, even his columns. I could read them as Mike Adams. That this social media doesn't always give straight.
No, yeah, that is a good lesson for social media, or even it's just email. You can't communicate tone. It's hard to communicate tone and inflection and these kind of things. So you need to be very careful. This is why social media and comments back and forth can be so caustic, because you can't sense tone and people get too snarky. So you really need to be careful out there. That's why I very rarely do that kind of thing.
Also, and I noticed this on his. I was looking at all of his social media the day after he passed, just trying to get a sense of what he was experiencing. And if I had passed a law in the United States that I think would radically transform discourse in the United States and radically transform. I'm going to give it to you now. This is free of charge. Here it is. The one thing that would change everything on social media. Here's what it is. When you get on social media and you set up your account, you must use your full first, middle, last name. 2, you must have a picture of you and your entire family as your icon. 3, you must list the city in which you live. If you did that, discourse would change overnight.
Yeah.
What is hurting us is anonymity.
That's right.
And if you look at the response, the people who responded to Mike Adams, aside from the kind of public celebrity naysayers, the celebrity hammer throwers, right? Who are just looking for a nail to hammer down. And those are out there. You know them on TV. You've seen all the different channels. Most of the private citizens who felt they had the liberty to scandalously say something about anybody are the ones who are, God hater, and they've got a little horn head icon.
Right, yeah. Really? Yeah, anti-theist. Yeah.
That's their moniker. Anti-theist, you can go to hell, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's great. And that's the guy who and I'm telling you, when Mike would look at those criticisms, he wasn't able to sort that out. In other words, this is an anonymous Twitter person with 12 followers who won't even use their real picture or name. I automatically, that's not even, those people don't even exist, if you ask me. I think that part of this, you would change all of social media if we required those things on our branding. And then you'd see discourse change, because no one wants to be the jerk when they know where you live and what your family looks like.
Let's have some questions or tributes. The great Jorge Gill can pop in, Jorge, if you want, or there you go. There he is.
What's happening, fellas? You can hear me now. I had my mic all the way down.
Hey, before I say this, though, Jorge, I just want to say people don't recognize this is true, though, because I was just with him. Do you realize that in a pandemic, the people who have big masculine beards like Jorge, when they put on that mask and then they pull it off, they have the mask impression on their beard. I learned that last week, as a matter of fact, from Jorge.
It was funny. I had the mask just printed on my chin. Well, we have, first of all, I want to thank everybody that are sending stars through Facebook. We have Orlando Santiago, Armin Gregorian sending stars, and also we have some super chats, and we want to recognize you because you are helping us to continue to do what we do through our mission here at crossexamine.org. Also, thank you, Jim, for being here. We just spent a week together down in during the CIA. That was a good time. Also want to thank Deborah Fredwell. She sent 50 stars just a few minutes ago. But now let's get to the tributes, because we got some great tributes here for Mike. Okay. I have Susan Collins says, I admire Dr. Adams so much. It's hard to believe he's gone. I wish I could have gotten to know him better. I met him once and he never forgot my name, always spoke to me on campus. That was Mike, guys. You have anything to add to that?
Oh, that point about knowing your name, that was true in Summit too. So Summit would remember you. Mike would remember you season to season. We have some Summit students, and Mike talked about this in Fearless Faith, who would come back maybe twice, maybe come back a second year. And Mike would remember who they were and remember their backstory. So it's to me, it's amazing that a man who's that interested in people could be portrayed as a man who's hurtful toward people. But you'll see a lot more of these because that's just who he was, and everyone who had contact with him knew that. So
right, yeah. I got Joel Mormon, and he writes from one of Mike's town hall columns. He says, "Let me get something straight about what I want my legacy to be. Put simply, I want to be remembered as someone who feared the judgment of an eternal God more than he feared the judgment of future generations. he said that in response to the right side of history argument, and it was a great perspective to have. What a powerful statement.
Yeah.
Yes, in fact, I think that I've heard Tim Keller say that recently in a story. He said, too many people fear everyone but God. And that needs to change, because we're too worried about somebody unfriending us on Facebook than we are disagreeing with the Savior that came and gave his life to save us.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, here we are, Christians, saying we disagree with Jesus. Well, if you're going to disagree with Jesus on marriage, on sex, on heaven and hell, why do you even call yourself a Christian?
That's right.
I mean,
Don't get Frank riled up again, okay? Because
who, Frank?
Yeah.
No, that doesn't happen often. We got Rachel Behringer says, the first time I've heard Mike was with these guys, and I love hearing him, and immediately went to see if he had any other teachings. He will be missed. And that is the reaction that Mike had. I remember hearing about Mike, several years ago, and I went and I looked him up, and I wanted to know everything about him. And that was because those who like us that knew him, I mean, it was a treat just to sit down and have breakfast or lunch or dinner with Mike and listen to him talk. It was amazing.
Yeah. And Mike also spoke from knowledge. It wasn't just a show. It wasn't just puffing up. He actually understood the law, understood the better than anybody I knew, and he also had a kind of a savant-like memory of case law.
yeah.
So if somebody asks a question on the stage, for example, Mike will say, "Oh, yeah, this is the case from whatever."
That's the Martinez case. Come on, don't you know that?
Yeah, exactly. Like, this should be common knowledge. This is why he was such a valuable part of our team, because again, it's a wrist, finger, elbow issue. This is why Frank is already. That's the face that Frank gives me when he's being patient but doesn't agree. But
No, I agree. I just want to make sure that if the elbow's doing this, it sometimes gets the finger to do that, okay?
Well,
because,
right.
I'm just an elbow. I can't do that. No, I'm sorry. You got to do that too.
That's right.
You got to at least support the guy pointing the finger.
But I'll give you an example of this. Mike would say the same thing. I remember driving up to Mississippi and talking about apologetics. Not Mike's thing.
Yeah.
Can't do that. That's not his lane. And he said, that's what you guys are for. And actually, I think Mike's thought of us as secondary to the whole project. Like why does anybody care about what you guys talk about? They're only coming to see me, right? But if they have a question about the Bible or God, you guys handle that thing. Not my thing. Right? So again, it's that we all just draw from our experience, and we do what we can to take a bite out of the same apple. Frank, you're never going to agree with me on this, are you?
Oh, no, I agree. I just don't want to give people an excuse to not speak up, because we're way past the time of saying, I'm not qualified to talk about that. No, you are qualified to say what Jesus said. You are qualified to say what you know is true. And by the way, let me say one other thing. People think that when you start giving a moral position on a political issue, that somehow that's just helping you. No, if Christianity's true, if there is a God and there are certain rights and wrongs, then you presenting that is for the good of everyone, even if they don't think so.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think that's where the battlefront is right now. It is on the moral teaching of Jesus. And that's you're absolutely right about that. Okay, sorry, Jorge.
I got another one here. Michael Matthews says, I watch Dr. Adams many times on Cross-Examine, such a brilliant mind and articulate speaker. This world is now a little more colder and less friendly due to the passing of Mike Adams. He will be greatly missed by the Christian community. There is a hole in our hearts.
Isn't that interesting, Frank, what he just said? Think about it. The other side is saying that the world is a little friendlier because Mike Adams is not here. But the people who knew Mike Adams are saying, no, the world is less friendly because, in other words, they saw the same person, yet evaluated him the exact opposite way. And this is the cautionary tale for social media. Remember, and even if it's somebody you despise on social media, you don't know that person. And that's why all good thinking, I always say that I cannot, if I'm going to talk somebody off a ledge, it's far better if I'm sitting next to them on the ledge than trying to reach them by phone from the command center. right?
Right.
Because you have to sit next to somebody. We would not be having this polarization right now if we were forced to deal with each other as humans. That's why the anonymous social media stuff has got to end.
Yeah.
And by the way, Mike told me just a couple weeks before he died that the COVID situation was very detrimental to him because he was out of the classroom. He lived alone. His fiance's 4 hours away. And it really drug him down emotionally and psychologically. So obviously none of us thought that it would go this far, but and I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I'm just pointing out the fact that Mike Adams would be alive today if it wasn't for a lockdown.
Well, I will say this, and you're right about that, because I wasn't going to bring it up until you brought it up, but he did say something to me, and he said the way he said it was powerful, because he said it kind of like, Jim, this lockdown has not been good for me.
Yeah, exactly. So
he said it like that, it was like,
sitting in my kitchen, which right over here.
Yeah. I said the same thing to me. So I do think there's the number of people who are. I was talking with somebody in Florida who runs a public school, a private school in Florida, and what he said is some of the students actually don't want the interaction with other students. They don't quite fit in. They feel the condemnation of other students, and they like being at home alone. The people who are suffering, the kind of the more outgoing, kind of leader stylists that are more engaged in social activity, are more by nature. They've suffered with the lockdown, and I thought, isn't that interesting? If we go 5 years with this, let's just say a thought experiment. If we went 5 years with this, that's not going to happen, of course. But if we did, what would happen is all of those who are socially interactive would probably end up not being with us. And those of us who are more a loner, who never engage other people, are actually more comfortable. And I'm not sure that's good for our society, right? I mean,
the head of the CDC is also
in culture.
The head of the CDC has also said that there have been more youth suicides than COVID deaths. In fact, I don't know if there's been virtually any COVID deaths below the age of say 14. I think probably zero is the number in America. But it's very low. But there is suicides as a result of that.
Yeah, amongst youth, that's true as a cause of death. But let's face it, if you hit the age of 24, you're more likely to die of the flu than COVID. So I mean, it turns at about that point. So
hey, let me just say one thing. I know we're going to deal with. Is my audio bad? Do I need to change mics or something, or what?
Don't know. Hyro did tell me that there is some off sync, but I don't think there is anything we can do here.
Okay, I just want to. I've seen several questions come through the feed here that I want to address. We have to address it. I'm always concerned about addressing this issue just because I don't want to give anybody the thought that it's okay to do this. But people are trying to say, well, suicide, does that mean you're automatically going to hell? Is this the unforgivable sin? And the answer is no, because the only unforgivable sin is to deny the witness of the Holy Spirit, which is basically saying you don't want Jesus, you don't want his salvation, and I know Mike was saved. But I don't want to give anybody the idea that that's okay, great, then I commit suicide. But I just want to answer the question directly. Jesus' grace, Jesus' sacrifice covers every sin. The only sin it doesn't cover is the one that you want to keep to yourself, and that is you don't want to confess your sins. You don't want to be with Jesus. You don't want your sins forgiven. Well, God's going to allow you to go your own way. He's not going to force you into heaven against your will. But Jim, do you have anything else you want to say on this? Because you have investigated and seen, of course, many suicide cases. Do you want to add to any of that, any of what I just said?
Well, I think part of the concern I think we have, and you said it so well, is that then if that's the case, is suicide just another option on the palette of reasonable options that will not affect my salvation to end my pain? And some people have chosen suicide that way. Here's what I would say. I know whatever pain you might be in right now, to end it, to play God in front of a holy God misses an opportunity to be shaped by God. And so I just don't want to miss opportunities for God to do something with me that I didn't expect, or that I can't see right now. and almost all the time shaping the chisel shapes and sandpaper shapes. And if we want God to use us in a way to glorify him and to grow the kingdom, we have to kind of weather the shaping process. And so I don't want people to see suicide as just another viable option to end pain.
No, I think, just to be honest, it's one of the worst things I've ever been through. And there are people much closer to Mike than I was, thinking of his fiance and his brother and others. The first thing I think of when I wake up every morning is Mike's gone. And I know that there are people that know him that can hardly get out of bed in the morning. Literally can't get out of the bed because what could have been? What didn't I say? What did I do wrong? And of course, you can't second guess yourself on any of this because
that was the first thing we started talking about after this happened.
Yeah.
Right. The first thing that happens is if you know you talked to him within 24 hours of him actually committing suicide, then you're not probably wondering, did I say something that caused it? But you're wondering, did I not say something that would have prevented it?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very natural inclination. So if this happens to you and you're wondering, but it turns out that the mechanism by which people to make these decisions is often very much detached from anything they're experiencing around them. For example, when we talked to him the day before, it was clear. The first day I spoke to Mike, a week before that, right? The first call that was about his post tweets,
Mm-hmm.
post, the settlement's going to be in place for his retirement. That I knew I had a positive impact on
Right,
Mike.
you did.
He was listening. He was responding to me. He was appreciative. We had I love you, Mike. I love you too, Jim. It was very much, I always told Mike before I hang up that I love him. So that when he would always say it back. Very good. Now, the second phone call, it was clear that he really wasn't listening to me.
He wanted to get off the phone.
And
yeah.
He was being polite, but he really could not wait to hang up the phone.
Mm.
And he was being polite.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew that it was a different kind of phone call.
Yeah.
And so and this often happens when people start to develop, they've already made the decision. It's not a matter of if anymore. It's a matter of when do I do it? Mm-hmm. And once you get to that point, you realize not much you can say.
Well, friends, any of you out there who are struggling with this, you need to see somebody. You need to let somebody know, because there's no closure on something like this. There'll never be closure for the people close to you if you decide to do this. And that's something you don't want to put on anybody else. You want to ensure that, as Jim just said, that you stay on this earth as long as you can to be his ambassador. Look, the reward, once you get on the other side, will compensate for any difficulty here. That's what the scriptures say. However, it can really be a blow to people that are left behind. Really be a terrible blow, and you don't want to do that to people.
Yeah.
Let me just say one last thing here too, Jorge, about Frank. And I'm just going to say it, and you can be mad at me later, but I don't know many people who have the kind of, like, I look at you tonight and you're fired up. But the Frank Turek that I know is one of the most caring people I've ever met. I think sometimes the cop in me is kind of tune certain things out. Like there's not a lot will get me upset anymore. I've drawn the circle so tight because if you don't draw it tight, you can't go to the next homicide scene without breaking it out. Right. So I just draw it really tight. And so when Mike passed, I was like, okay, so let's see. This makes sense. I'm thinking about it like a detective. On the phone with you, though, Frank, you were been emotional on the radio. You were emotional on the phone. And I think a lot of people probably don't even realize that even you, as the warrior that you are, that side exists. Mm-hmm. And so you might think that if I do this, I won't really have the impact on people who I previously didn't see this way, didn't see as emotional, mm-hmm. didn't see as being so hurt by something. But as it turns out that you actually, this is devastating.
Yeah.
And it leaves many open questions. One thing we know is that right now, at least we haven't gotten all the computer stuff done back, but there doesn't appear to be that Mike left a message for us.
Yeah.
And that's been asked. Mm-hmm. Did Mike leave a message? Mm-hmm. And without a message, there's not even a sense of like understanding precisely. We're trying to figure this out still. And we're just figuring it out loud with the permission of the family in front of a live audience. But we don't have much clarity because we don't have a letter that tells us exactly what the cause is. And so a lot of this is just us kind of grieving publicly.
Mm-hmm. It is. Anything else you got there, Jorge? That
Yeah, I actually got a great comment from Randy Smith. And Randy says, "This is no place to share my story, but I've been in depression and attempted suicide. And your mind goes to places you would never had expected until you get there. It is complicated, but sometimes nothing someone does will change your mind or help. But sometimes even a good word from a stranger can change everything." So this is coming from someone who's lived through this depression and attempted suicide. So it is just, I mean, I read this just to say this. You don't know what's going on through people's minds. And
right.
And especially when you have such a weight on you, just like Mike did. And, it's just difficult. It's difficult for us that I've been through a difficult time in my life where today there hasn't been any closure, and in Mike's case, we don't know if that's going to come, but we just know that we believe in a righteous God that is going to make things right one day, and that is our hope.
Yeah, and I would just say to this too, add to this, that I often get asked this question: once I get justice, will I get closure? No, you'll get justice if we're lucky.
you mean for homicide or something like that? Yeah.
If it's a homicide, we're going to trial on a homicide. And so this too, we're all want some closure on this. There will never be closure unless, of course, the Christian worldview is true. And then every question will be answered. Every hope for justice will be satisfied. Every desire for mercy will be realized. This requires closure requires a Christian worldview. Because if you think you can get that in this material universe in which we live, there's lots of injustices. I still haven't solved many of the cases. I haven't even been able to move an inch. There is no closure. And even those who we've convicted the killer will tell you, well, I'm glad you convicted the killer, but it doesn't bring her back.
Right.
Doesn't make the wrong right. That's true. And that's true. Unless, of course, Christianity is true. And then we do have the supreme judge who will make it. And we're guaranteed, we're told there will not be a tear we will cry. There will not be, that will be gone. We will have perfect knowledge we don't have now, the knowledge we don't have now. And that, I think, will in the end bring closure. I think that this is a really good reason that we talk about a lot of things. That we talk about a lot of things that we follow Christianity. Like we talk about stealing from God. Well, one of those concepts is closure.
Right.
You get that. It's not even available unless you completely.
Or justice. You're not going to get that either.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And all those cases that somehow you couldn't solve, Jim, the guy's never going to get justice if there's no God.
That's right. He's going to get away with murder. You can only get away with murder.
That's right. Yeah. What else we got, Jorge, before we sign off?
Just to finish up here, and I know some people are saying, hey, we have some audio problems, and really it's one of those things that we cannot do anything about it at this point, because it will require for us maybe to reset either Jim or you, Frank. So just bear with us. We're at the end of the show. I have a great comment by Summer Wheeler, and she says, I love that you mentioned that, Jim, because I'm reading Mike's letter to a young progressive book right now, and I can hear Mike's voice. Even though I didn't meet him, his teachings always resonated with me at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. His debate with the abortionist doctor a couple of years back was one of the most profound debates I have ever heard. In honor of his life and legacy, my goal is to read his Summit 10-book reading list. He will be missed, and I love Mike Adams.
Yeah.
Yes, get his book, Letters to a Young Progressive. The subtitle is How to Avoid Wasting Your Life Protesting Things You Don't Understand. It's a great book. It's a great subtitle. And we have a couple of Fearless Faith programs that Jim and I did with him. One is called Fearless Faith. The other is called Fearless Generation. They're available at our website if you want more. And there's plenty on YouTube.
I hope, Frank, that we are able to continue to do these.
Yeah.
Honestly. But I know that it'll never be the same.
No. No, he's irreplaceable.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask our viewers to pray for Mike's brother, David, and his wife and nephew, Mike's nephew, kids. He's got a niece as well. Also pray for his fiance and just his extended family and friends. He was buried last Saturday, and there will be a memorial service coming up, but you'll hear about that. Some of you might hear about it. It's going to be semi-private. That's coming up in a couple of weeks. But thank you for praying for his family and his fiance. And if you would, at least use Mike's legacy to stop hiding under your desks.
Yeah, somebody has to fill this void.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be somebody who can speak publicly about these issues and is willing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, guys. God bless.
Thanks, Jorge. Thanks, Jim.
No problem.
God bless everyone.